Not used to that. Over these last couple of weeks and through this kind of month of January, we've been focusing on our vision series, which we've entitled Live Different. Choosing to live not just different for the sake of difference, because sometimes for us that might mean living a little bit odd, weird, crazy, annoying, frustrating. That might be what we're talking about in terms of living different. That's not actually what we're talking about. We're talking about living into the way God's actually created us, wired us, calls us, empowers us to live. And that's expressed so well by our vision prayer. Oh God, with all our hearts, we long for you, first of all, because we want more of God. We want to know God. We want to experience his presence in our life. And I'm hoping this is going to go away pretty quick here. So come transform us, change us from the inside out, transform our character, transform who we are so that we would be more Christ-centered in who we are, that we would be empowered by the Spirit and gifted by the Spirit, that we would be mission-focused, looking outward to see what God sees of the world around us, and ultimately making disciples everywhere that we go. And so this is the kind of different living we're talking about, not just a different because we're a little bit odd, even though we might look a little bit odd as we are living into the things of God, but living into what he has called us and empowered us to do. And so today what we're going to be talking about is living with a different kind of posture. The last couple of weeks we've talked about living with a pursuit of holiness. Living with a life that pursues God and his transforming work in us. Last week we talked about living with purposeful hospitality. How do we engage and invest in those who are other than us and welcome them into loving relationship? So today we're going to be talking, though, about a different kind of posture that we can live with as we walk through our life. And is there a reason we don't have slides this morning, or can we pop those up? Thanks, that'd be great, just so it'll be easier to follow along. Thank you very much, perfect. There we go. So, living with a different posture today. We're actually in two texts that we're going to be in today, both Philippians chapter 2 and John chapter 13. Can I just preface this message by saying, this is not going to be a message where you go, oh, light bulb moment. This is not like a lot of new info. I think what this is for me is this is a lot of info that I already know that I don't always put into practice. And so maybe this message for us this morning isn't so much about, ooh, I didn't know that, as much as it is, ooh, I'm not actually doing that. So anyways, we'll see what comes out for you as we dig in this today. But you know, as I thought a little bit about living with a different posture, I actually thought about bringing the flip chart up here today to do a little bit of Q&A with you guys, but maybe you can just, share some dirty looks with me if you think I'm wrong. How about that? Is that fair? That work? Okay. We'll assume that that's what those mean. Anyways, so when I think about the general posture of people and how we live in our world today, what kind of stands out is a posture of a little bit of puffing up of self, some of tearing down of others, but a posture of, I'm just going to say, I think I'm better than you, or I think that you need to come along with the way that I think about the world. And if you don't, then you have a problem, clearly. And so there's a bit of a posture towards others that seems to be prevalent of elevating myself and looking down on you if you're not in agreement with me. I don't know, would you say that's a fair assessment of the posture that we see at least fairly prevalent around us? I see some nods and just a few dirty looks, so that's nice. The thing is, this isn't just true of people outside of the church. This is often true of us as followers of Christ. As I watch conversations occur online, as I hear people's discourse in conversations with one another, whether on media or in person, as I sometimes look in the mirror and hear what I'm saying and the way I'm saying it to others, I see this posture also reflected in the people of God, which apparently is a really profound thing. But the thing is, as Jesus followers, we're actually called to live with a much different posture than that. And if we lean into this idea of seeing God transform who we are and our character and the way that we live, this is going to be a part of that transformation, is living with a different kind of posture in the way that we hold ourselves and in the way that we interact with others. So we're going to read Philippians 2 because Paul in this letter speaks directly to how we should interact with one another as followers of Jesus. This is what it should look like as we live together just doing life. So he says, therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, if you've experienced anything from Jesus that's been positive, then make my joy complete by being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and of one mind. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, because he did that, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that's above every other name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven, on earth, under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose. So if you've received any grace, any positive thing from Jesus, and if you are a follower of Jesus, I really hope for you that you have. You've received the freedom from the guilt and bondage of sin. You've experienced the deep love that he has for you that goes so far beyond all of the mistakes you can make. You've experienced life as he meets you in the midst of trials and struggles. You've experienced joy that doesn't make any sense in the midst of some of those challenges. I hope for you that as you have walked with Jesus and as you know Jesus, you have experienced a great deal of benefit from knowing him. But if you have experienced anything from Jesus, then the call is to be like-minded, having the same spirit, being filled with love, acting not out of selfish ambition or pride, but being humble. Having the same spirit in us, the Spirit of God, who ultimately leaks when he's inside of us. We can't help when the Spirit of God is moving in us and filling us up to start evidencing some of the character traits of the Spirit of God, which if you read Galatians 5 tells us that those character traits are love and joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, goodness, faithfulness, and self-control. Those things will be coming out in you as you have this filling of this same Spirit between us, which means we should be walking in gentleness and kindness and love and humility with one another. Paul says that means that we should be considering others' needs before ourselves. Lifting up others is more important than ourselves, looking to their rights, not my rights, and seeking what's good for them, not just what is good for me. A posture of humility, a posture of surrender toward one another. Now, if you want to sum this up in just a really brief statement, you could say, be like Jesus. Because that's what Jesus looked like. Not grasping onto rights, and he goes through this whole thing, right? Even though he was in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Even though he is God himself, he didn't hold on to that to lord that over us, but instead he made himself a servant to come and demonstrate sacrificial love for us. Be like Jesus, who didn't grasp onto his rights, but made himself a servant. He had rights, right? He actually had rights. It's not like Jesus had to do this. He actually had rights, and he chose to set them aside and become a humble servant to do something for us. And he did that by going to the cross and facing a humiliating, agonizing execution so that the debt of our sin could be paid for in his death, and we could experience life with God and forgiveness. But in addition to doing that for us, Jesus also modeled this in his teaching and how he lived when he was here on earth, in the kindness that he expressed to Jew and Gentile alike, to broken and whole, to people who were struggling with all kinds of sin issues, and people who were possessed by demons, and people who were sick and frail. And it didn't matter who you were. Jesus expressed the same kind of loving kindness to people as he walked this earth. Mercy to the weak, compassion to the lost, sacrificial relationship with his disciples, who honestly were not the best of friends all the time. But that's what Jesus was like. That's what Jesus is like. That's how he lives. So if we want to talk about what this looks like, be like Jesus. And to just kind of dive a little bit deeper into that, I did want to tell a Jesus story today. A story of, seeing how Jesus actually played this out with his disciples while here on earth. And that's the story that comes to us from John chapter 13. And we're going to kind of read this a little bit chunked up, not the whole thing all at once. We're going to read it in pieces and kind of just pause along the way to observe a few things about this story and about what Jesus was doing in the midst of this. So chapter 13, we'll start in verse 1. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. So first thing I want you to notice is this story is a love story. Not a sappy story. This is not a chick flick story. This is not a movie that I watch with my wife. But it's a love story in that it is an overwhelming, stunning demonstration of what love can be. And that's true both in what we read in chapter 13 and the events that are going to follow from here. In a sense, this statement at the beginning of chapter 13, verse 1, about he showed them his love right to the end, that's actually a statement of all that's coming. It's going to be modeled in this moment, almost like a living parable, how Jesus is going to do what he does in chapter 13, and then from there we see how this is going to play out with his suffering and his eventual death. So this is a love story that Jesus shows. This is what it means to have the same kind of stunning, self-sacrificing love that God has for us. This is what it looks like, okay? So this is a love story. This is about seeing God's incredible love. The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God and was returning to God. So this is one of the things of the story that to me is probably the most shocking part of it, is to think about what Jesus knew in this moment. So if you look back, verse 1, we already know that Jesus knew that his hour had come, it said, right? Jesus' hour had come, which meant that it was the time had come for Jesus to go and live out what God had called him to do in going to his atoning death on the cross. He knew it was time for that to actually take place. He knew who he was. He knew he had come from God and was going back to God. So he knew he was the Son of God. He knew he was the Messiah. No doubt about him knowing that he is the Son of God who's come to do this thing. He knew that he had authority. All things had been placed under him. He had power over all things. God had given him authority over all things. So Jesus had authority in this moment and was really above everything else, positionally. And he also knew Judas would betray him. He knew the guy that would sell him out to the Romans, well, first of all the Jews and then ultimately the Romans, was in the room. The guy who had been paid off for some silver and was going to turn Jesus over to arrest and death, was sitting there with him at the table. And knowing all those things is what makes this event even the more stunning and shocking, because of what Jesus does next. So, he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel around his waist. This idea of him setting aside his clothing, laying down his clothes. There's an interesting note about this. Actually, the word that's used for that is the same word that's used in John chapter 10, which is when Jesus is talking about being the good shepherd who will lay down his life for his sheep. That's where we see this kind of becoming a parable about what's to happen. Jesus is laying down his clothing. He's laying down his life to serve and demonstrate the sacrificial love of God to his disciples. That's what Jesus is doing in this moment. So he lays aside his clothes. And then verse 5, after that he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped around them. Jesus takes the form here of one of the house servants. Not even a really high, powerful house servant. By doing this thing of humbling himself, getting down on his knees, with the towel wrapped around his waist, one by one going around the table. The disciples likely would have been reclining at the table, which would have meant like the table was here and their heads would be up there and lying backwards on their side with their feet out the back. And so Jesus is going around the back of the table to all the disciples' feet and one by one picking them up, pouring some water over, taking the towel, drying them off. The act of a house servant. The one who has authority over all things, who is king over all things, is the one who's coming around behind each of the disciples and doing this very, really intimate act of love. Washing each of his disciples' feet. Serving those who would soon run away and abandon him. Serving the one who had accepted a payoff already and who Satan had already entered and who was going to sell him out. Doesn't it blow your mind that Jesus came around behind Judas and did the same thing with his feet as he did with the rest of the disciples? He did it for Peter. Peter, who was going to say in just a few hours that he doesn't even know who Jesus is 3 times. Jesus washes his feet. He serves every one of them knowing what's coming. Now, unsurprisingly, there's a bit of an objection to this act of Jesus. And you could never guess who it comes from if you've been following along with us. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, you're going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize now what I'm doing, but later you'll understand." "No," Peter said, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Well, unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Well then, Lord, not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him. And that's why he said, "Not every one of you was clean." Yeah, shocker, Peter's the one who speaks up. In fairness to Peter, though, don't you think the rest of the disciples were thinking it? I mean, there's always the one in the room who's going to say something, and the rest of us are kind of going, yeah, like what the heck is going on? This doesn't make any sense, Jesus. So, Peter gets a bad rap, but honestly, I think he was probably just speaking up what everyone else was thinking in the moment. Maybe he was thinking that he would gladly do this for Jesus. But Jesus, I don't want you to do this for me. Like, you're king of the universe. You're God's Messiah. You are the Son of God. You have done miracles. You have healed people. You've cast out demons. You are the one who was to come, who we've been expecting, waiting for, longing for. I am an unclean person. I should be washing your feet, not the other way around. Isn't that one of the hardest things for us about grace? is actually accepting it. The one who's perfect, who dwells in majesty in heaven, who is the king over all of creation, looks down at us, and if we look inside and see all the brokenness and messed up values and priorities in our own minds and lives, how could God ever love me? God, I don't want you to do something for me. I want to do something for you. And yet in this moment, Jesus says, no. If you want any part of me, I have to do something for you. This is part of the scandalous gift of the love of God, which truly is scandalous. If you read through the gospel accounts, look at how the love of God is actually portrayed. You know, leaving the 99 sheep to go chase after one. A father who hikes up his robe and goes running out to a son who's completely abandoned him in love. It's crazy the way that the love of God is portrayed in the gospel and how Jesus models that in this moment even. A scandalous love that he would do something for a bunch of people who really don't deserve it. Kind of like me. During our response time, we're going to sing a song that I know has created some controversy around the lyrics, because the song is entitled Reckless Love. And it says, oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. And the reason we struggle with it is because God isn't reckless. God knows exactly what he's doing. He's very, he's not this just throw everything to the wind. He has a plan. And I think that's true. But I think our experience of the love of God is that it is incredibly reckless. That he would pour out his love into the places he does, oftentimes without any return whatsoever, looks incredibly reckless. If you were to do that with your money and treat your money the way God treats his love, we would all think you're an idiot. And we'd be looking in judgment at you like we were talking about earlier because we're all prideful and arrogant. This is the kind of love that God pours out. In our minds, it's scandalous in how he does it. That's what Jesus is doing in this moment. That's why Peter objects to it, I think. It doesn't make any sense to him. Well, after doing what he does, Jesus is going to explain what this was all about. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on clothes, returned to his place. Do you understand what I've done for you? He asked them. You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that's what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. Very truly I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. Well, Jesus gives them the explanation of what this is about. This incredible act of sacrificial love that he's poured out for his disciples. And then he says, I want you guys to go and do what I did for you. Follow the leader. You guys are not better than the one that you follow. No servant is greater than his master. No messenger is greater than the one who sent the message. So if Jesus did this for us as his followers and acted in humble, self-sacrificial love, and we claim to be the followers of that person, how can we do any less? What right do we actually have to say, you know what, I know Jesus did it that way, but I actually have a better way? How do we think we can do that? Jesus did not grasp at his rights or his position. Wow, that was a tough word. Or his power. He didn't grasp onto those things. Didn't even really worry so much in that moment of who was worthy of his love and service and who wasn't. He served them all. And we're called to do the same, not grasping to our rights, our position, our power, maybe not even deeming who is worthy and who isn't of our attention or our love or our compassion or our service, but rather choosing to humble ourselves in sacrificial service to one another. Jesus makes it pretty clear we don't get to think ourselves as above this. But man, is that hard. isn't it? So, what do we do? See what I mean? There's not a lot of new stuff here today. Not a lot of new stuff to know, but man, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. So, simple points of application. Simple to understand. First thing is just be like Jesus in this. Be like Jesus in our posture. Having a posture of surrender, of humility, valuing one another above ourselves, actually looking to the interests of others before our own. That's what we're called to do as we actually live out what Jesus has done. You'll be blessed if you do this. Now you may be saying, well, Dave, why don't we wash each other's feet in church? Maybe we should. Maybe we should. I know there's been all sorts of discussion and reasons why and why not and all those kinds of things over the years. I get it. But maybe actually practicing the act would help us live that principle out a little better. I don't know. I think the principle is what's really important in this, but maybe sometimes an action would help us move our hearts into alignment with our heads a little better. So let me ask you this question. How do you think Jesus might be inviting you in particular to be more like him with a posture of surrender and humility? How do you think he's inviting or challenging or convicting or smacking you over the back of the head with a velvet-covered 2x4? That's for my buddy over there. We talk about that often. That's how God has to get my attention sometimes. But how might he be inviting you to live more like him with humility and surrender? Could it be about how you deal with things online? Honestly, I got to tell you, church, I cringe when I watch Christians interacting online. When it's often hate-filled, arrogance-filled rants about who's right and who's wrong, about the status of the other person who doesn't agree with them, not showing any respect for one another, but looking to tear them down and humiliate them. I wonder if Jesus showed up and looked over your shoulder while you were at your keyboard, what he'd think of what you wrote. Like, are we being invited to maybe look a little different and interact a little different in this place that honestly lots of people see? And if I was a non-Christian looking at some of the interactions of Christians, I would want nothing to do with Jesus either. Why would I bother? Because it looks like what everyone else in the world does. It's just a different topic. So who cares? How are we reflecting the character of Jesus when our posture and tone look nothing like his? So maybe we're being invited in the things we type, in the things we write, in the ways we communicate with people online to be a little bit more humble and surrender to Jesus in that is how we treat people, lifting up their needs above our own. Maybe it's if we've been mistreated. Some of you have been mistreated by others. And maybe Jesus is inviting you to take his posture of humility and surrender, even though you have been wronged by someone else. An opportunity, which if you read in Matthew chapter 5 or 6, to turn the other cheek, as Jesus called us to do. If you're hit on one cheek, turn the other one towards the one who hit you as well. Maybe if we've been mistreated, it's an opportunity to shine the light of Jesus and who he is by the way we actually choose to live it out with that person. I get that there's a time when we may need to take action to make sure things are safe. I get that. I get this is not easy. But I just wonder if sometimes when we're being wronged, if we were to look more like Jesus, who actually was led like a lamb to the slaughter and didn't open his mouth, who was being wronged with the authority and power of God in him and still didn't fight back or call down a legion of angels to wipe out all the idiots who were going to take out the Son of God. He didn't do that. So why is it that we so passionately fight hard and nastily for our rights? So, I have a couple other things I was going to say, but let's just talk about this. So here's what happened in my week this week. There was a couple moments, and this is great, right? This happens in a week when I'm preparing this message. There was a couple of moments specifically, I'm not going to tell you what they were, but a couple of moments that came up where I absolutely had the opportunity, because what was happening I felt was unjust and not okay. I had the opportunity to live out what Jesus did, and I didn't. I resorted to getting my back up, to getting my voice up, and to start going after the other person. And in that moment, you gotta love God's sense of humor. Dave, what are you preaching on this Sunday? This is not easy, folks. It's not easy in the world that we live in when there is so much stuff, so much brokenness, so many people fighting with so many things that they often don't even realize how badly they're coming across and tearing into you. But when we go tear them down in return and in retaliation, that's not living out the way that the one we follow lived. And he's invited us to live like he did. So as we think about living different, as we think about living different in this world, I think one of the most striking things would be that we would actually live with a posture of surrender and humility. Because it looks radically different than anything else you see in the world. Radically different. And if we're following Jesus and being transformed by him and honestly seeking that transformation out, I think that's what's going to happen to us. It's going to increase our humility and surrender. It's going to decrease our concern about our own rights. It's going to decrease the amount of pride that we have. It's going to decrease our desire to be self-sufficient and run things on our own. We're bound to look a lot more like Jesus when we're walking with him, filled with his Spirit. And this is one of the spaces that's going to happen. And let me just say this, because it probably sounds a little harsh, but I do see that happening in you. Can I just say that? I do see that in you. I mean, we all have moments where we blow it. I had a couple glorious ones this week. We all do it, and that's okay. But again, when we do it, we confess it to Jesus and say, Jesus, I'm so sorry. I did not represent you well. I repent of that, and I choose to go a different way and walk with your humility in my life, in the things that you are calling me to go and do. And one of the things, church, that I think helps us in this, as we turn our attention to our time of response, is to truly be overwhelmed with the experience of God's love for us. When we actually grapple with and wrestle with the scandalous, and I'll say it reckless to us, love of God that abounds even in our stupidity and our brokenness and our sinfulness and our vileness and our awfulness that we have as a part of who we are. Day-to-day stuff happens. Even in that, God's overwhelming love washes over us. And he longs to embrace us, like John said, to wrap us up in that big hug, to know we're in that safe place, loved by our Heavenly Father. And I think that's one of the ways to combat some of the stuff about pride and all those things where we feel unsafe and we feel the need to fight back out of a corner, is to remember who's in our corner. The God of all things, whose love for us is so much beyond anything we could ever ask or imagine. And so as we turn our attention to our time of response, I want to invite the servers for the communion table to come on up, those in the prayer room, Terry and Maureen, head of the prayer room, to serve there. And as we prepare for our time of response, if you're new here with us, this is what we do every Sunday, is we want to give you time to kind of to wrestle with, to pray about, to seek God about what he's calling you to do in response to what you've heard today. And there's opportunities to respond in different ways that we try and give you each and every week to actually live into and maybe have a tangible experience of the things that God wants to stir and do in you. And so we invite you to come to the table. This is the Lord's table that Jesus set for us, with the bread that represents his body that was nailed to the cross for us, to give us that atoning death so we could be free to live with God in relationship. And as we come and receive that from Jesus today, we can be reminded of the immensity of God's love shown in this atoning sacrifice. That he would go through the suffering and the execution that he went through, unbelievably painful execution he went through for you and for me. And we can be nourished by him in our walk, no matter what we're walking through right now, and overwhelmed with his love, so we'll walk more like him. We have the prayer room open. I know the doors are closed. We're going to say that for a while probably because the glass thing is new. But they're closed only for noise. It's open so you can go in. And then just close it behind you so you can hear what's being prayed and they can hear what you're sharing. But it's an opportunity in our prayer room to come and humble yourself and seek God's help. Like Peter, receive that God wants to do something for you. Sometimes we don't ask because we're too prideful and we think, I'm going to figure it out on my own. Why do we do that to ourselves? Maybe we don't understand enough about the love of God for us, that he actually delights to do things for us and realizes that when we do it, we do a terrible job. So go and ask. Go ask him to meet you and help you with what you need from him. A little later on, our ushers are going to come and receive our offering. And that's an opportunity for us just to lay down a part of sometimes what's so important to us and give it back to God. Remember that he's the one on the throne. And we're going to sing. We're going to sing reminders of the abounding, sacrificial, seemingly reckless love of God. We're going to sing that one out today. And so we invite you to come and participate in this response and in our time of singing as well. Krista, I might get you to start this one. I'll join in a minute. But why don't you stand and let's take some time in response together.